Okay, let's get started. Hi everyone, welcome to today's webinar. My name is Stacy Sattung with the Housing Alliance of Pennsylvania. Thank you for joining us for today's webinar titled COVID-19, Immediate and Longer-Term Strategies to Mitigate the Impact on Tenants and Landlords. To let you know, this presentation is being recorded and will run approximately 90 minutes, including a question and answer time. We will also send you a link with the recording via email over the next few days, as well as upload it to our YouTube channel and post on our website. Attendees, you all will be muted during the presentation. If you have a question for the presenters, please type them in the Q&A box in the bottom of your screen. If you have a logistical question for myself or Housing Alliance staff, please use the chat feature. The chat feature should not be used for questions for the presenters. Again, if you've got a logistical question, please put it in the chat. And if you have a question for the presenters, please use the Q&A. I will now turn it over to Housing Alliance Executive Director, Phyllis Chamberlain, to begin today's presentation. Phyllis.
Great, thanks, Stacy, and hello, everyone. Welcome to today's webinar. This webinar is part of our series talking about COVID-19 responses focused on supporting low-income households, the organizations that serve them, and the landlords that are renting to them. This is our third webinar and our second focused on strategies that can be put in place for landlords to work with tenants to mitigate the negative consequences of the almost total economic shutdown as a result of the pandemic. Today, we're going to focus on mediation as a practical strategy that was in place in some communities before the pandemic that can be expanded or created in order to address what we know is already an increased need to support tenants and to make sure that they can pay their rent and avoid eviction. We're going to hear about new and existing models in Philadelphia and Pittsburgh that can be replicated in any community in Pennsylvania. We're also going to hear from Gail Schwartz, who works with me here at the Housing Alliance, about how the Housing Alliance wants to support your local effort to build a mediation program or to expand upon it. Before we get started with today's webinar, I also want to make sure you're aware of another webinar that we're having next week. We at the Housing Alliance are very dedicated before the pandemic, during the pandemic, and after the pandemic to making sure that the resources to help low-income households and people experiencing homelessness are available. We're particularly concerned, as you all are as well, about a significant increase in evictions because tenants are unable to pay their rent. None of us, of course, know the full extent of what the economic recovery will look like, but we do know a few things. We know that low-income households are disproportionately represented among people who have lost their jobs because they work in the industries that were the hardest hit because of layoffs and reduction in work hours because of the pandemic. We also know that many low-income households struggled before the pandemic to make ends meet, including paying their rent, and they will therefore likely continue to struggle. We also know that early reports indicate that when the economy begins to recover, jobs will not return at the same rate. So for all of those reasons, we know that Pennsylvania needs more rental assistance at the state level to avoid evictions and help tenants pay rent, but also to make sure that landlords have what they need to meet their own obligations. We're hosting a kickoff advocacy event next Thursday to talk about joining together to advocate for state rental assistance. If you receive our newsletter, You will find within that newsletter that will be going out today, you will find information on how to register for that event. If you do not receive our newsletter, go to our website, housingalliancepa.org, or email Stephanie at info@housingalliancepa.org. What we're going to talk about today is a very practical strategy, in my opinion, for how to make sure that the tenant-landlord relationship is as positive as it can be to help tenants avoid eviction. But we also really need to advocate together for more rental assistance. With that, we're going to start today's panel. We are going to hear from some folks in Philly about their program. We're going to hear from Carolyn Brown, who's with the Office of Community Empowerment and Opportunity with the City of Philadelphia. We're going to hear from Lex Harris with the Tenants Union Representation Network, and Sue Wasserkrug with the Good Shepherd Mediation Program. Following their presentation, we'll hear from Jane Downing with the Pittsburgh Foundation, and then Gail Schwartz with the Housing Alliance of Pennsylvania. Carolyn, I'm going to pass it off to you.
Okay, hopefully everybody can hear me better now.
That is great. Welcome back.
Okay, great, thank you. But I think I lost my video of myself, but I'll bring it back in. Sorry about this. Thank you everyone for your patience. Really appreciate that. So again, thank you Phyllis Chamberlain and Gail Schwartz and everyone at the Housing Alliance for giving us this chance to talk about this program. This is a relatively new initiative, so we're really looking forward to sharing information for both landlords and tenants who might be interested in seeking out mediation services, as well as any nonprofit or public agencies who might be interested in possibly starting a program of their own. So again, we're really thankful for this opportunity to talk about this program. Again, my name is Carolyn Brown. I'm Director of Planning and Evaluation for the City of Philadelphia, Office of Community Empowerment and Opportunity, and I'm going to spend a really short amount of time just quickly going over some background information, the genesis of this program, why we launched it, why it got started, after which I'll turn it over to Sue Wasserkrug, who will talk about how the program operates, and then finally you'll hear from Lex Harris, who will talk about the role of the tenant advocate in this program. So this slide provides some basic background information. I'm going to get rid of this for a moment. Just to give you a sense of the context in which we launched this initiative. So as many people know, Philadelphia is a city that has been plagued with high rates of poverty, high and persistent poverty over several years. Currently, about 25% of Philadelphians live below the federal poverty line, and it in fact has the highest poverty rate of the 10 largest U.S. cities. So in terms of the scope of the problem, this just the stress on low-income renters in particular has resulted in something on the order of 20,000 eviction filings annually, which impacts about 1 in 14 renter households. And we are also experiencing a growing lack of affordable housing. So just in terms of context, back in 2015 and 2016, there was an increased focus on evictions, both nationally and locally. You may recall Matthew Desmond released his book on eviction at that time. Locally, we had some research that was done by Philadelphia Legal Assistance and the Reinvestment Fund, and they did a really great job just compiling and analyzing eviction data here in Philadelphia and helping us better understand the nature of the problem. In response, in early 2017, in the spring of 2017, Philadelphia City Council held hearings, and that further engaged the public in the nature of the crisis and what was going on. And one outgrowth of this focus was a decision by Mayor Kenney to launch a task force to deal with the eviction crisis. trying to advance the slide and it's not going. Okay, here's the next slide. Sorry about that. The Mayor's Task Force on Eviction and Prevention and Response was launched in the fall of 2018. The membership was represented a cross-section of advocates, leaders, government officials. You can see examples of the types of folks that participated on the task force on the slide. One of the results was the task force met for about 9 months in 2017 and into 2018. And it issued a report, a final report in June of 2018, which released 17 recommendations for Philadelphia to address the eviction crisis. That report is available online. We have a URL here in the presentation, but you can also access it online. It's actually fairly easy to Google. The 17 recommendations of the task force were divided into 4 buckets. They're listed here on this slide: outreach and education, resource and support, housing standards and enforcement, and legal process and policies, including pre-filing mediation. By pre-filing, we mean mediation that seeks to intervene at an early stage in the dispute before it goes to court. This is important because there are important consequences of eviction. There are consequences for both landlords and for tenants. The consequences for landlords include unpaid rent, vacant units, turnover costs. The consequences for tenants include potential homelessness, an eviction judgment on their record, which can impair their ability to access future housing, just life disruptions, potential loss of possessions, moving costs, and of course, the emotional toll that it takes on families. We heard from both landlords and tenants during the task force that, in fact, eviction was a last resort that nobody really wanted to have to pursue, if at all possible. So we thought that doing something to help parties resolve issues before it goes to eviction would be received, would be well received, and could really make a difference in addressing the eviction crisis. So what are the steps we took to launch this pre-filing mediation program? First of all, we started with a collaborative process, the pre-filing mediation action team. This action team is one of 5 active subcommittees that are part of a larger body known as the Housing Security Working Group, which is charged with implementing the recommendations of the Eviction Task Force. The action team met and it began to review best practice, engage in, I should say, best practice research. We looked at programs across the country to get a sense of what other cities were doing. I think we had conversations with programs from Boston and from Denver and other places we looked into. We also developed a model that we thought was appropriate for Philadelphia and began to develop a proposal that we might be able to use to seek funding. We eventually applied for seed funding through AARP's Community Challenge Grant, and we were successful in getting that grant, and we used those funds to select program providers through a competitive process. This slide just gives you a sense of who's on this pre-filing mediation action team. You'll see co-chairs from the Pennsylvania Apartment Association and TURN. We thought it was important to have leadership from both landlords and tenants in this particular action team. We also have the membership listed there, and you can see that it represents a diverse set of organizations that represent advocates and people in the public and private sector who all work in the area of housing or working with housing insecure families and individuals. So the short-term pilot, we were able to launch it in fall of 2019. We used the pilot to basically demonstrate the effectiveness of the model on a basic level. The pilot ended in December of 2019, and right after the end of the pilot, we began making plans to try to expand it into a 12-month pilot. And so we were in early 2020 when we were kind of starting to finalize that process, and of course came the impact of COVID-19. So the immediate impact of COVID-19 was, of course, that everything was placed on hold for a short period of time. And then secondly, we realized that our face-to-face mediation model was not going to be able to go forward as we had originally planned. Good Shepherd Mediation eventually informed us that it had the capability of offering a virtual landlord-tenant mediation program. So we kind of switched gears and started working on trying to adapt the program to respond to the COVID-19 crisis. We also kind of acknowledged that mediation could even, in theory, be even more important in the current environment. Why is that? Basically because of what the impact is going to be of COVID-19. Obviously, the economic impact, job loss and income loss, and the financial hardship that's going to impact both landlords and tenants. And then secondly, the legal impact with the stay-at-home order prohibiting physical operations, various breaches and defaults under leases, and then the moratorium on court-ordered evictions. For tenants, that means they may not be receiving typical repairs, they may be unable to move out in a timely manner. Landlords may not be receiving rents, they are unable to honor lease start dates because previous tenants have not moved out. There's also court closures that could result in significant backlogs. So all of these things made us confident that mediation would really make a big difference in helping landlords and tenants hopefully resolve their problems during this COVID-19 period of disruption. And we're really excited to be able to try to offer this program as part of the response to help support housing during this time. So that's a short overview of how we came to launch this program. At this time, I will turn it over to Sue, who can talk about the program in more detail.
Thanks, Carolyn. You're going to continue to control the slides, right, Carolyn?
Yes, I will.
Okay. Okay. So, and I apologize. I'm going to go through this really fast, and then I have to jump off the call or the presentation briefly, but I'll be back for some of the question and answer. So just first of all, what is mediation? It's just a process sort of distinguished by self-determination. In other words, it's a process where the parties themselves create the resolution to the conflict or the dispute. The underlying theory of this is just, conflict isn't going to go away. It's a part of life. So, what we want to look at is what's the best way to resolve conflict. And our theory is when parties have a say in the outcome is more satisfying and long-lasting. So the hallmark of this process is the use of a completely neutral third party. So we always tell people, like a judge, a mediator is completely neutral, but unlike a judge, we are not going to tell you what to do. Compared to litigation, the process is, it's a lot less expensive, less stressful. We can usually schedule you much more quickly than you could get into court. And we try to work with parties in terms of scheduling, so it's a little more flexible. We like to think that it's suitable, it's better suited, it's well suited for situations where there's a dispute between two parties who have a relationship that, has some history and that is going to continue, like landlord-tenant, like custody disputes, like neighbor disputes. Because there's a real emphasis on communication between the parties, communicating to resolve this issue that is confronting the two of you. And so as a result, in addition to resolving the issue, there's better communication going forward. And then as Carolyn said, you've completely, as all mediators around the country have, shifted gears to doing virtual mediation sessions instead of face-to-face. In the past, we sort of described mediation as an opportunity for parties to come together and, come to the table. Well, now they just come to their computer or their phone, whatever. But once, as soon as we realized that in late March that this situation was going to continue, we quickly shifted gears to offer virtual mediation. You can go to the next slide, please. Carolyn? Okay, Carolyn, can you switch to the next slide? Okay, I don't have access to this PowerPoint. So I think the next slide basically is just what is the Good Shepherd Mediation Program. We're a nonprofit. We've been around for about, I don't have access to the slide. If pressing enter didn't do anything. So Good Shepherd Mediation Program is just a nonprofit that we've been around for about 35 years. We're an independent nonprofit. Our mission is to help people resolve their disputes without resorting to violence or yeah, the slide, the PowerPoint is not up on my computer. I could try to pull it up, but it seems like, yeah, Lex, if you can share, that would be great, because it might take me a while to find it on my computer. Okay, thanks, Lex. Okay, so here you can see we're Philadelphia's only community justice center. We've been around since 1984, and our mission is just to encourage peace, reconciliation, and social justice, and empower individuals to resolve their conflicts. Okay, and if you could just move on to the next one. We just provide a range of services, mediation, restorative practices, and training and consulting. Okay, so the mediation process begins with someone contacting us. It can either be through a referral or a word of mouth. We get a lot of people who find us. And then we do an intake. We reach out to the other party, and then we schedule a mediation session. As I said, now the mediation sessions are we're either doing them by conference call or something like this, a Zoom call, depending on what's best for the parties. The tenant in this particular project always has access to a tenant advocate through turn. So if the case has come to us through turn, then obviously we keep turn informed about when the mediation is scheduled for. Otherwise, we connect the tenant to the tenant advocacy representation network, or the tenant union representation network. Then we facilitate the mediation. If the parties reach an agreement, we draft the agreement. Used to be the parties would sign it in real time. Now we get a little more creative. And then we do a follow-up about a month later to make sure that the parties are keeping up their end of the bargain. So the mediation session itself starts with some introductions. Both parties have an opportunity to really share their perspective and their concerns and their goals. Then we engage in the problem solving. The mediator facilitates the conversation. And then hopefully if an agreement is reached, the mediator writes it up and the parties get to read it. Even with the virtual mediations, we've found we're able to share the screen like this so they can actually read it before they agree to it. And then during the session, they also, if necessary, or if they would like, we give them an opportunity to sort of take a time out from the session and consult with either the tenant advocate or if the landlord wants to consult with an attorney, we give them that opportunity as well. So all kinds of issues might come up. I'm not gonna, in the interest of time, I think I'm not gonna go through these, but as you can imagine, just, you know, any kind of conflict that might arise between a landlord and tenant. And the more that we do this, you know, every call is a little bit different. Every situation is a little bit different. It could be subsidized housing, private housing, you know, a landlord wants to sell the house, just purely financial issues, repair issues, all kinds of things. Oops. So, and then the agreements can really be anything that the parties can think of, and you know, obviously that's legal, you know, but pretty much anything that works for both of the parties. It could be a repayment plan, it could be, you know, negotiating sort of an exit strategy for when the party's when the tenant might move out, a schedule for making repairs, or some sort of, you know, the tenant will stay, but the landlord will provide certain, you know, repairs or certain improved conditions, or stopping things like harassment. So really pretty much anything you can think of. Okay, and so I'm going to jump off the call. I'm going to turn it over to Lex at this point, and I'll be back. Thanks.
Thanks, Sue. Hello, everyone. So I'm Lex. I work for Turn, and I serve as a tenant advocate in this pre-filing mediation initiative. Despite the name of the organization, Tenant Union Representative Network, as a tenant advocate, I do not formally represent the client. Generally, both parties go through mediation without legal representation. They're proceeding with an intent and with an understanding from a practical standpoint. And my role is really to provide as much insight into the legal context that I am able to, in terms of any relevant laws, and then how the law works in practice. The point being to really serve as a point of access for specifically the tenant to gain information about the laws, what, for example, they could be risking if an agreement is not reached, what, if any, legal claims they might have, to really be able to go into mediation with an informed sense of their standing, their position, and help them just formulate a strategy as well. The role of the tenant advocate, and generally the accessibility to landlord-tenant context from a legal standpoint can be pretty vital to just protecting the integrity of mediation, such that parties can make an informed decision going through the mediation. Generally as well, from the tenant perspective, tenant generally has less bargaining power. So to go in knowing their rights provides for a much more healthy mediation process. So what the role looks like specifically, of course, I'll answer any of the questions of the tenant. There's a pre-mediation consultation. I'll just make sure they know that they know generally what their rights are, what their lease says, and then help them come to a point where they develop some sort of strategy, some sort of goal, to actually think about how this can be, how this situation, their situation, can be resolved. Would they be willing to waive certain legal claims, waive security deposits? If it's about non-payment, it's also about getting them access to resources, which is all a part of it. Just again, a point of access for information, as to promote an effective mediation, an effective resolution. The purpose, again, of a tenant advocate is not legal representation. So although I am an attorney, a tenant advocate can be anyone with knowledge of the landlord-tenant law and process, and or be able to access that information. So again, as a tenant, you can make informed decisions. And likewise, that principle carries over to the landlord as well. And to that point, I just want to quickly draw just our attention to the context of these mediations, the law surrounding landlord-tenant. Mediation is not intended as law enforcement, and that is, and the purpose is really, as Sue mentioned, a practical resolution based on the parties' definition of how you can traverse the issues that are arising, how you can get through the weeds, so to speak, about your particular issue. However, knowledge of the laws can only promote a healthier, more productive mediation, and again, protect the integrity of the mediation. So this entails, of course, our statewide Landlord-Tenant Act, of course, federal fair housing laws, when tenants have a right to something and or the landlord should respond in a certain way. Those sorts of things can be addressed in the mediation. Local ordinance is important to keep in consideration, where a court might handle certain facts one way. That's not necessarily the case in mediation, because again, it comes down to how do the parties see this? How can both of the parties get through the issue, address the issues? What is the middle ground? And then, of course, the stay-at-home orders, to be aware of how that's impacting landlords' ability to come to the property, how COVID-19 may raise protections under Fair Housing Acts if, for example, you're exposed to COVID-19. These sorts of realities are important to, again, contextualize the mediation. And from the tenant's end, I certainly talk them through their posture and situation. And then Sue did not mention, but it's helpful that the mediators are also trained in the landlord-tenant law so that they can pull on that information if need be, and I'm available for that as well. In considering mediation, certainly we encourage to mediate and not litigate, and this call to action is particularly pressing, I'd say, right now with the likelihood of mass eviction, really, with the incredible impact that COVID-19 is having. We encourage mediation, and we see a real value to it. Some things from a practical standpoint, whether it would be worthwhile or not, are pretty basic. Simply the willingness of the parties to mediate. The willingness doesn't mean you have to be willing to agree to everything the other side is demanding, simply to host that conversation. So are both parties willing to schedule a call, engage in discussion, and are you willing to compromise? Is there going to be room for conversation to reach middle ground, to really creatively think about how to solve the issues that are coming up? And to that end, simply the act of real and meaningful engagement that mediation provides, that may be by itself beneficial for the two parties. Oftentimes at arm's length notices, communication, They can't fully appreciate a situation, and a mediation is a great forum venue to get to the bottom of issues, and to hopefully and ultimately reach an agreement that both parties can set their own forward without the negative impacts of court. Also, tenant groups, there's a lot of tenant organizing going on right now because there's no real clear legal protections. So tenants want to collectively discuss these issues with landlords. And frankly, it is depending on the landlord whether or not they engage with the group from a collective standpoint. And so mediation may be a great thing to consider to practically kind of streamline the communication if there is a tenant group that wants to designate a leader or an informal representative to discuss some of the issues and potentially chart a path forward. Of course, there's legal and economic reasons to mediate and not litigate. Avoiding litigation is and can be a win-win. There's excessive costs during this time. As we all know, courts have been mostly closed throughout the state. They may be beginning to open in your district, but there's going to be a significant backlog, a significant lengthening of time. And so it's really, I would pose to folks considering mediation, a why not kind of question, why not mediate now to see if mediation may be able to provide some stability for the situation. And if you don't try it, you know, if you try it, there's no harm done. A lot of times we'll run into technical non-compliance with landlords, something that a situation may be that it's not worthwhile. It's not worthwhile or it's not permitted for a landlord who is, for example, unlicensed to file in court. Mediation is a court-free alternative that can again promote the more intimate sort of addressing specifically what the issues that are going on and specifically how to move forward. To that end, it's also a meaningful opportunity to discuss reasonable accommodations. Again, where at arm's length notices may not fully appreciate a situation, a mediation provides a great opportunity to do so. And lastly, I would put to you all to really consider what is it in the context of our own personal jobs, what is it that we can specifically do to lessen the impact of COVID-19? And I think the reality that COVID-19, the losses and costs associated with COVID-19 and a lot may yet be unseen, these losses need to be shared, they need to be acknowledged, and ultimately landlords and tenants, from my view, will benefit from stabilizing housing in order to provide and promote a footing for financial recovery. That loss on strictly tenant side or a loss on strictly the landlord side, that's just not a reality. That's possible. So figuring out a way to allocate, to share that loss, to address whether or not it's possible to stabilize housing for some time, avoid eviction, is I think it's some real moral consideration, but it's also, there may be some real cost effectiveness that you should consider. Certainly mediation, the Good Shepherd program is actually a free option. So for folks in Philadelphia, it's really something, again, of a why not mediate and see if you can avoid the eviction process and the incredible negative impacts that it will have on a tenant, the communities, and of course, it's just our housing market at large. To access mediation, folks can get in contact with Sue, with the Good Shepherd program via email, via phone, and online. And of course, if there are questions, I know we'd all be willing to answer questions if anything wasn't covered or isn't covered later in the Q&A.
Great.
Technical disruptions.
Great, thank you, Carolyn, Lex, and Sue. That was a lot of great information. We're all benefiting because you all had the forethought to put this program in place, so thank you. We're next going to hear from Jane Downing, who is with the Pittsburgh Foundation, about Pittsburgh's efforts to create this type of program. Jane, I will pass it off to you.
Thanks. And Lex, can you take the PowerPoint off so I can share mine? I am actually filling in for Megan, thank you, for Megan Stanley, who is the director of the city's housing, city's Commission on Human Relations. And the Pittsburgh Foundation has been involved with eviction issues since Matthew Desmond came to town, whom he did an incredible public service to highlight the impact of evictions, particularly on African-American women with children. And I've been convening a group of, a very diverse group of court officials, tenant advocates, housing providers, landlords, the public housing authorities, as we try and understand all these issues related to eviction. And I honestly think the Mayor's Task Force in Philadelphia has got the best way of describing the complexities of these issues of anything that I've seen. So I really would recommend you all access that report. So I'm just going to give some background on what we're doing and where we are in the process of developing a community mediation and eviction diversion program. Allegheny County has approximately 13,000, almost 14,000 evictions a year. 5,000 of them are within the city of Pittsburgh. So we're a much smaller community than Philadelphia, but landlords win judgments in roughly 85% of these cases at the magisterial district court level. Our court system is very different than Philadelphia's. We have 46 individual magisterial districts. And there is a single housing court in the Court of Common Pleas at the appeals level. But we really are dealing with 46 individual judges and their systems. An eviction filing, as was noted by Carolyn, I think, stays on a tenant's record for a very long time and impacts future housing options. In many cases, it's like credit reports. Landlords pay to get access to that information, and some use it to act as a blacklist to screen tenants from not even showing the apartments. There is actually a legislative option to that, a procedure that's been referred to the Senate Judiciary, no, the House Judiciary Committee to seal eviction filings until there's actually an eviction case. Most of the evictions are filed against tenants for non-payment of rent, although I've been told by landlords that in fact that's the easiest way to file an eviction than trying to go through drug-related issues. But our research shows that the vast majority of the tenants are paying less than $1,000 a month in rent. And a third of those cases are paid with those paying less than $500 a month. The overall impact of evictions is that they're costly to everyone involved, to the landlords, to the families involved, and to the sense of community. My background is in housing and community development, and I never understood the churning that goes on in low-income communities as people move. And a lot of that churning is due to evictions, detrimental to children's education, despite the McKinney-Vento Act, which says the child may go to the school where he started. Anyway, severe impacts. Okay, so why mediation? And I almost feel like I don't need to do this because the previous presenters have given a really extensive explanation of why mediation and what it involves. But we're looking at it because we have heard that a neutral third-party model is actually better than asking landlords to ask their staff to try and intervene on why people are not paying rent. That and when tenants don't want to talk to management personnel or to the landlords if it's smaller, then they end up in magisterial district court. It offers equal time to both parties, and unlike the court process in Allegheny County, which favors landlords, landlords win most of the time. The proposed model would be free to landlords and to tenants, and hopefully it would be an incentive to try mediation before filing for eviction. There is a history of other cities who have done involved mediation in the eviction process with an 80 to 90% success rate. And the way that we are thinking about it is that mediation would not happen in a vacuum, that we would wrap in other referrals for other kinds of assistance. And Megan had succeeded in securing funding for the Western Pennsylvania Mediation Council to organize pro bono mediators to help in eviction cases. The mediators who belong to the council are trained every year, and there are about 30 in the pool who've expressed interest in helping in Pittsburgh and Allegheny County. And Megan's primarily concerned with the city of Pittsburgh. Here's a slide of other cities that have piloted mediation and with success rates. You can see one of the reasons that we're interested in the Cambridge model is because it utilizes the community development block grant funding. And we are, because I work for the Pittsburgh Foundation, we are always interested in long-term sustainability, so that if we could access some community development block grant funding for the mediation program, we, beyond a pilot, which Megan is proposing, we might have a shot at some ongoing funding for it. Okay, and the key components that we've been discussing about eviction diversion program is mediation, a single service provider utilizing the pro bono trained mediators who can provide a response to housing conflicts. And this would be the Western Pennsylvania Mediation Council. Rental assistance, which can address issues of non-payment. We have actually a couple different options for how rental assistance could be coordinated. The Urban Redevelopment Authority has a housing stabilization fund, which provides cash assistance up to $3,000 or 3 months back rent, but it's also for back utilities and first and last month rent or deposit, I'm sorry, security deposits. So, and that is part of a fund that's called the Housing Opportunity Fund that is being funded through a percentage increase in the realty transfer tax. So $10 million a year is coming for 12 years is coming to the Urban Redevelopment Authority for a variety of programs, and the housing stabilization program is currently been allocated at $1 million a year. Or it could be to a direct housing service provider. The housing stabilization program has 4 providers, and then the Redevelopment Authority created a special COVID-19 fund and directed that to the Urban League of Western Pennsylvania. And so a referral could be made directly to one of those 5 providers. Financial coaching could be an offered service. We have a system of financial empowerment centers with a financial counseling organization, and they do short-term financial counseling. This would conceptually, we're thinking of this as a voluntary program if either tenants or landlords would be interested in the service. And then finally, social service support. The research that the Pittsburgh Foundation has done over the last couple of years, both quantitative and qualitative, has shown that there are many complicated reasons why families do not pay the rent in a timely way. Life happens, and oftentimes it's related to healthcare, food insecurity, or other situational effects. And we do have a 211 referral service that actually services most of the Commonwealth of Pennsylvania, but we also have a very robust integrated human service system in Allegheny County. So it could be a referral details to those service supports as well. I think we haven't completely determined what the ultimate program design is going to be. Megan has had conversations with one of the magisterial district judges who is willing to refer cases in the context right now of the backlog cases that are on hold because of the eviction moratorium, to see whether they would be, any of the entities involved in those cases would be interested in mediation. They could, either the landlord or the tenant could seek the mediation and eviction diversion and contact the mediation council. Or we could do it through pre-filing, which is actually the Pittsburgh Foundation very interested in trying to develop a program that is really pre-filing. If we can avoid the whole thing, it would be, and address whatever underlying causes might have contributed to the non-payment of rent. The Commission on Human Relations can refer cases as well that are out of their jurisdiction, but would benefit from mediation. And finally, the housing authorities could use eviction diversion in the first month of eviction instead of filing for eviction. The housing authority of the city of Pittsburgh has a policy that as soon as a payment is missed, they immediately file for eviction on the premise that it's easier for a tenant to become compliant with a smaller amount of money than if it is if they wait for a couple of months. And what that has resulted in is about 1,000 filings a year on average over the last 8 years. And it would be to everyone's advantage, we believe, if we could develop a pre-filing program to avoid all of that disruption to both the tenant and to the authority. And that's where we are in the process of securing funding, getting things ready to go, and I think testing it. It is we're thinking of this as a pilot. That if we can prove the concept that in fact it would be extended throughout all the 46 magisterial district judges, if we have that kind of power and resources. And I think the Mediation Council is also interested in exploring the model statewide. So I'll take any questions when it's appropriate. Thank you.
Great, thank you, Jane. That was all really helpful information in terms of all the thought that you all have put into it. I will say that that slide that talks about the different ways that the process can be initiated is particularly helpful for people across the state who are considering the different ways to start this type of program. So thank you. Next, we're going to hear from Gail Schwartz, who is with me at the Housing Alliance, about some ways that we are interested in supporting these local efforts. After we hear from Gail, we will take questions. If you have a question, please type it in the Q&A box. If we have so many questions and we run out of time to answer them all, we will answer the questions in writing and we'll send them out after the webinar. Gail, I'm passing it to you.
Great, thank you. So, and to go back to what Phyllis said earlier in her opening remarks, is that this is now the third webinar in our series in addressing COVID-19, and a second webinar that really focuses on strategies that can help landlords and tenants make their way through this crisis. And so one of the things that really has come up as being challenging to negotiate is eviction moratoriums, the closing of the courts. And we know that this has sort of created this window of people don't know what to do. There's not enough resources to go around. There are more resources coming, but they haven't quite come down the pike. And so we know that in order to stabilize housing, there's two things that we need. We do need to get money and to ensure that the business contract is fulfilled, but we also need communication. Communication is absolutely critical. So what we've been doing is really trying to advance tools to help foster that communication. Last week, we put out a toolkit that both landlords and tenants can use to help initiate a conversation about finding out what are the arrangements that can be made until financial assistance can come to the tenant, whether it's in the form of unemployment benefits or a rental assistance program, or maybe their employer is, qualifying for the PPP program. Any number of things can be happening, but it's all very slow going. But we also know that sometimes, people need a third party to sort of help facilitate those conversations. And we've seen two great examples of that work already happening in Philadelphia and Pittsburgh. But we also know that those are not the only places that it's happening, or where people are starting to think about mediation as a way to really preserve the relationship between landlords and tenants until financial resources can start to flow a bit more. So one of the things that we want to do next at the Housing Alliance is we want to start to get folks from all across the state to do a kind of mediation peer learning. Whether you are from a community that has already started a mediation program, like Pittsburgh or Philly, you are in a community that had a mediation program, but you're trying to figure out how to make it virtual so it can be a viable resource in the time of social distancing. Or you're somebody who is really looking to build this from scratch. We want to help get all of those folks together to share what they're doing, what they're working, everything from funding sources to technology resources to program design. If you are at all interested in participating in that peer learning group, we'll probably have our first meeting 2 weeks from now. But what I'm going to do is I'm going to ask my coworker Stacy if she can put up a poll. All you have to do is mark yes, and we will take your email information from your registration and use that to follow up with you after today's webinar. And we really, really want to see this type of intervention be expanded in many communities across Pennsylvania, if not all communities across Pennsylvania. We do know that the courts are going to be starting to reopen, but just like other aspects of the state reopening, courts are reopening at different paces in different phases. So just to give some context, I got onto the Unified Judicial System of Pennsylvania's website this morning and just looked at what was happening at all of the different county courts. And, you know, of the 67 counties in Pennsylvania, there's about 30 of them that have already extended the judicial emergency at the county level to go to the end of May. So, and again, when you start to, you know, get into those individual communities, for some, that means the courts are going to be closed all the way through to the end of May, just as they have been closed and nothing's changing. But for some of them, it does mean that there is actually some phased reopening and alternative processes to start to process some of these claims, and that will impact landlord-tenant cases specifically. Some communities are looking to start doing those cases virtually through teleconferencing and Zoom formats. So there's a lot that's happening. It's varying a lot by community. It's a very nuanced issue. And the great thing about mediation is that it is built to meet the nuance of these issues. And so we really want to start to work with all the communities out there that want this and get as much good information to you and hear all the good information from you. And so that is going to be the immediate next step. I will be the point of contact for that work through the Housing Alliance. So if anybody has any questions about it or needs anything, I am available by email as well as by phone. So with that, I am going to pass it back over to Phyllis.
Great, thanks, Gail. We're now going to take questions. Again, if you have a question, type it into the Q&A box. And the question that we're going to start with is, how is success defined? Jane, in your presentation, you had mentioned that a survey of other mediation programs showed an 80 to 90% success rate. Can anyone talk about what is the definition of success for this type of program?
My belief is it's avoiding eviction. That there was a resolution and the tenant stayed in the unit and the landlord got paid.
Great. Anyone want to add anything to that answer?
Yeah, I can. This is Sue. I apologize because I didn't hear the context of that statement about the success rate in mediation, but what I can say is that mediation in general, yeah, we do talk about mediation having about an 85 to 90% success rate, and we consider that success is sort of defined by the parties resolving the dispute in a way that you know, they're both satisfied with, because if, you know, either they're willing to sign an agreement, which is a success, or they're not, and they wind up resorting to some other sort of resolution strategy.
Great.
We also consider success. We find that sometimes just the process of them coming to us and us reaching out to the other party, sometimes it doesn't even have to come to the table. And the situation, you know, it just opens up the lines of communication.
Great, thank you. The next question is about virtual mediation. What considerations are being made for tenants who don't have internet access or other modes of technology?
I guess that might be for me too. We're doing conference calls. We have not yet run into somebody who didn't have a phone. So yeah, we haven't encountered, I don't think I've ever encountered that in my 5 years at Good Shepherd. So as long as they have a phone, we can do the session by conference call. And I'll tell you, as a mediator, I was, we're always like, that's not gonna work because you can't see each other, but it has not been a problem.
Okay, great. The next question is, can these agreements be entered into as an order from the local magistrate? Sue, your current program is voluntary. Jane, it sounds like you all are considering if it's voluntary or if it be required in some way. So can anyone talk about the pros and cons of requiring versus voluntary?
I guess I can try to do that again. Yeah, we talk about mediation being voluntary. There's sort of a model in the custody context where in a lot of counties in Pennsylvania, when you file a petition for custody, you're required to attend a mediation orientation. You don't have to, because mediation is voluntary, you don't have to follow through. So that might be a model, to look at. I don't know what the statistics are on how many people, actually use the service, but that could be a model on how to, how to handle that issue.
Okay.
Yeah, and
Go ahead,
Phyllis, I think Megan's conversation with Judge Pappas, I think he's actually been trying to encourage landlords and tenants to mediate from his seat, but he has no resources to do it. So yeah, in that way, but I don't think he's mandating it. I think and at the common pleas level, there are pro bono mediators available for people coming into housing court. And I don't think, because I think it happens before the case gets to the judge, that's voluntary as well.
Okay, thanks. There are a few questions about cost. I'm pretty sure that you all indicated that this is a free service. Can you confirm how that works in Philly, and then Jane, how you're thinking about it in Pittsburgh in terms of cost? What's the cost for this program?
Well, I'll tell you, because the mediators are pro bono, they're trained every year in mediation practices, techniques, and things, but it is pro bono. So at the moment, the main cost is the coordination, which is, I think I said it was a $50,000 grant for coordination. I know there is also some discussion about paying mediators, and I don't know how far that conversation has gone. We know which magisterial district judges see the most number of filings. We have a top 10 list. And so if, as this evolves, it looked like it was effective to try and have paid mediators for some of those district courts. I mean, that would be a consideration, but at the moment, it's all being discussed as pro bono.
And you folks in Philly want to respond to that?
Carolyn, do you want to, or do you want me to take that?
Sure, I can say something, but I'll turn it over to you. I do think that we are really interested in being able to provide some funding for paid mediators just to support the long-term sustainability of the program. My understanding is that Good Shepherd's model is based on volunteer mediators. And so I think the way our program is moving forward, we're anticipating using a mix of both some paid and some voluntary. So I'll turn it over to Sue to add any more detail to that.
Yeah, that's about right. I mean, you know, we have other programs, you know, for the most part, we rely on volunteer mediators, but for certain programs where there's a whole lot of need, we find that it can be useful to have, you know, to pay people a small stipend, just because if we're relying on them a lot more. But for the most part, our mediators are volunteers.
Great, thank you. The next question is, how do landlords feel about this program? What do they say about it? And then an additional question is are they required to participate before litigation, which I think we addressed a bit. But the question, how do landlords feel about it? What do they say about it? Which I would say that how landlords participate and how you approach them would also be great if folks could answer that question as well.
My experience in reaching out to landlords to propose this as a next step in addressing whatever has come up, either it's a fairly larger management company and they tend to want to do a mediation on their own, which Ms. Downing did reference the benefit of a third party. And it just kind of levels the playing field for both the tenant and the landlord. So frankly, the landlord buy-in has been an obstacle in many situations where a tenant certainly would avoid would rather avoid going to court and raising issues. And then the landlords who are more willing to participate in mediation, which by the way, the premise is that they're not required for this program. Either the courts or the legislators have to create some kind of diversionary program to require this. Landlords who are willing, though, you know, tend to be very satisfied with the mediation. It's hard for me to put my finger on why exactly it's not being taken up. The cost from the participant perspective is zero in terms of any sort of payment because it's a free service, and the only cost is the time commitment, which is simply maybe 1 or 2 hour mediation. And then whatever internal kind of review has to happen with the agreement. It is an obstacle, and I think just the way in which you propose it can make a big difference. But I guess a lot is to be seen as well.
Great, thanks, Lex. The next question is, how is the mediation initiated? Is it the tenant? Is it the landlord? Is it a service provider? Or is it any of the above?
I guess I can take that. It's kind of any of the above. I mean, if someone, usually what happens is one party either reaches out to us or, you know, some other agency that they've been working with reaches out to us. You know, we get some information, and then our sort of standard MO is that we would then reach out to the other party. But if the first party, the initiating party, if they would prefer to bring up the possibility of mediation with the other party, that's fine. We're happy to do that. We tell them, just give the other party our contact information and then we'll talk to them. But usually we reach out to the other party by mail or preferably email, just because it's so much quicker, to give them an opportunity, to sort of emphasize the fact that we are the neutral, we're neutral, we're a neutral third-party facilitator. This is who we are, this is what we do. This other person reached out to us to request our services. It's voluntary. If you'd like to participate, please contact us.
Okay, thanks. The next question is about doing this work virtually. How are you dealing with issues like privacy and signatures needed on certain forms?
Creatively. We haven't had a problem yet. We're not using Zoom. We're using another platform called Teams. It hasn't been a problem. In terms of signatures, we have the parties fill out a consent to mediate form in advance. So we send it to them in advance and have them send it back to us or email it back to us, or at a minimum, they've read it, and then the mediators will, take their verbal consent. They'll say, yes, I read the form and I consent. And the mediators will make some sort of notation that happened. And then with the agreement form, we have two mediators. We generally have two mediators on any given case. So one is sort of leading the mediation, and the other one is participating as a facilitator, but also taking notes and writing up the agreement and then reading the agreement out. And then it's sort of the same thing. If the people, if it's a video call like this, they share their screen. If it's a conference call, they in real time email it to the parties. In a worst case scenario, they read it a couple of times. And again, sort of get a verbal consent or take a break and reconvene if absolutely necessary, if the parties want to consult an advocate or an attorney.
Great, thanks. The next question is about funding sources. What funding sources can be used to start a mediation program? Certainly funding sources are going to differ by community, but Jane, you had mentioned using the Community Development Block Grant for this program. Can you talk a bit about if you've already secured that funding and any barriers that you found in terms of accessing that funding so far for this purpose?
Megan started on this journey before COVID-19 came, and she's the head of the Human Relations Commission, so is within the administration, and she approached them about using the 15% set aside for the for social services under the Community Development Block Grant program. And although I was a city employee for a long time and actually coordinated the capital budget for a portion of that, and we ran the Community Development Block Grant program. At that point, there was a mayor, there was like a set aside for that the mayor shared with city council. And I just have to believe that what she was asking for was the mayor's part of the mayor's set aside. But in reality, when the CARES Act was approved, entitlement cities and counties got extra community development block grant funding and extra emergency solutions grant. And so the 50,000 was part of the emergency CDBG funding. And that was approved yesterday, I think.
Thanks, Jane.
Oh, I should say that part of the CARES Act, they lifted the 15% cap from the COVID-19 allocation. So that allowed, and out of that funding, actually $1 million in community development block grant funds went to the Urban Redevelopment Authority to augment their housing stabilization program, which already had been authorized for $1 million from the realty transfer tax.
Great. And I just want to reiterate that there is additional community development block grant funding that's being administered by local governments and the state government. It was increased as part of the COVID-19 pandemic. So certainly there's a lot of needs and a lot of resources, but CDBG might not be a funding source that people would think about for this purpose. So thanks, Jane, for highlighting that. We are at the end of our time. There's so much more to say about this issue, and I really want to thank Carolyn, Lex, Sue, and Jane for sharing your progress on mediation. A reminder that if you would like to have more of a conversation around mediation in terms of building or expanding a mediation program in your community, to contact Gail. We'll make sure that you have her contact information when we send out the materials after this webinar. We will send out the recording as well as the materials that were provided. And a big reminder to join us next Thursday for our kickoff to talk about advocating together for more state rental assistance to keep tenants in their homes. Thank you, everybody, for joining us, and more to come in terms of how we can all work together to make sure that low-income renters are considered and prioritized as Pennsylvania begins to recover from the pandemic. Thank you.